Welcome, everybody. I'm here with my good friend George Gantz, and we're in another episode of Consciousness and Consilience. I want to thank everybody for joining us on this journey, and stay with us. It's getting more interesting as we're continuing to go through E.O. Wilson's book called Consilience. We do have a few final thoughts on chapter 4. We feel that we didn't quite summarize chapter 4 as good as we could have, and we think there's still some points left to discuss before we move on to chapter 5. So, George, what was the nagging question or tap on your shoulder that seems to uh, pull you back into chapter 4?
Yeah, it goes back to some of the things we've talked about earlier, is kind of looking at what is a scientific orientation and what is coming out of faith. And I think one of the things that was clear in chapter 4 is that E.O. Wilson just has a very powerful belief in the perfectibility of science. Science and math being able to answer all questions and ultimately leading to a perfect understanding of things. And yet even he in chapter 4 is kind of despairing about the fact that it doesn't seem to be coming there, and some people and philosophers are kind of giving up on the goal. And my point is he doesn't recognize that the perfectibility of science is an article of faith. It's not it's a metaphysical principle or faith principle. It's not science per se. And he talks about the ways that science hasn't been able to achieve that, but he really doesn't accept the possibility or recognize the fact that this is an article of faith that he believes in and he's committed to it. But you can't prove it, and certainly the difficulties in science are some evidence that it's not perfectible, and that's one of the threads that that I've been writing about over the past few years. So I just think it was important to go back to that point, to say you have to respect him for his scientific acumen and is willing to step in there with speculations, but he's not recognizing his own bias in terms of this dogmatic commitment to the perfectibility of science as the answer to all questions. So I think that was just something that I wanted to touch upon before we go to probably one of the most poetic and beautiful chapters of his book, and that is Ariadne's Thread, chapter 5.
Yeah. Your introduction was really great, and I want to do an exercise with you, George, to see if there's bias is the wrong word here, right? It really is, but there's a consistent thread, to use that metaphor, of our dialogue that I think in our next series or book that I'd like to focus on, and this is just a suggestion and throwing it out for everybody to bear witness to here. I'd like to explore the other side of this equation of science versus religion. And so I'd like you to start thinking of a book where the response isn't science isn't really acknowledging their bias. I'd like to be able to go to something theological where I'm really immersive in this world of something inspirational, with respect to how you see things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes great sense. And I'll think about maybe a text that we can focus on for next time. I mean, there are many sacred texts, but I'm also thinking of people that have talked about religion in a different context. There's Robert Wright's Evolution of God, certainly very, very approachable for, he himself is an agnostic, and so it's very approachable to think about it. And also it ties in the idea of the fact that religion evolves too. Religion is actually human construct and effort to understand the understandable or know the unknowable.
Mm.
And so that work is a nice one that kind of puts the two together. It looks at it from a sort of a scientific evolutionary standpoint, but has some significant conclusions as well about what it offers to humanity. So we'll think about that. I think that's a great topic for the future.
Yeah, so that point brought me, what I thought of was a Cartesian kind of science. Now, I'm not talking about a metaphysical imagining of dualism, but what I'm talking about is the idea of a mechanistic um, uh, conceptualizing the way Descartes looked at mechanizing animals, for example. Okay, and so his perception of consciousness was that we as sapiens were uniquely endowed with something that was different than say a dog, right? And had no qualms about ripping a dog to pieces surgically and trying to understand a dog from a mechanical standpoint. It's just horrific, right? This
Yeah,
kind of concept.
yeah, yeah,
And so I guess the point that I want to make here is that if I'm adding, or do you see a similarity that if I was to make judgment on science based off of something that happened in the past, which was Descartes, that I would be condemning myself to something that was absolutely horrific, barbaric, like, do you know what I'm saying?
yeah. And the same applies to religion.
Well,
I mean, it's easy.
that's where I was trying
It's
to, in defense
easy.
of,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's so easy to attack religion on the basis of events in the past,
yeah.
um, and not realize that, let's put some context around that and realize, I don't want to digress too far, but the the Inquisition is a good example of all of these
Mhm.
terrible things of lynchings and all that stuff, and yet the statistics that I've seen is, this was sort of a wave of mob psychology that was largely driven by local towns and communities suspicious of foreigners and funny things going on. And the Catholic Church decided they needed to get control over this. So that's when they sent judges out in the communities. And the actual numbers of people that were massacred and burned at the stake is pretty small. And well, I don't know, I don't have it handy now, but it was a lot smaller than the kind of mayhem that happened when, conquering crusaders, went down into the Middle East, and a lot smaller than the secular massacres of the 20th century. So anyway,
Mhm.
that's a digression, but you make a very good point. If we're going to take a look back at what science and scientists did at certain points in time, or how they may have gotten off track at certain points in time, we have to ask the same questions of other ways that people have made attempts at knowing the world, and religion is a good example of that. So it's great. Great.
Well, there was a quote that I was working on the planksip site, and the title of the article was "The Ethical Treatment of Animals."
Yeah.
Maybe that's why and I do. So there's this quote from Immanuel Kant who says, "He who is cruel to animals becomes hard, so in his dealings with men, we can judge the heart of a man by his treatment of animals."
Yeah. Yeah.
And do we have something to learn from that in this particular day and age? Absolutely. Right.
Absolutely. Agree. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I don't know about yourself, but I can't, like, I'm not in a position where I don't, you've heard that phrase of "don't eat anything with a face" kind of thing, right? But
Yeah.
maybe there's a part of uh, nature or our biology that requires animal meat for the time being. Essentially, I don't know. I just
Yeah.
part of
I'm amused to see all of the faux meats, like faux bacon, and my sisters were into that. Well, this stuff's made out of turkey instead of, and you know, uh, they made it taste pretty good. It tastes almost as good as the real thing. And I can just imagine when algae are used to create a high quality uh, textured protein that can create the same effect, as a burger. There'll be no excuse anymore for eating, eating from the hoof, taking from it.
Yeah.
There's no excuse for that anymore.
So the
Yeah,
only extinction we should be excited about is the extinction of a domesticated feedlot type of production animal, where we're knowingly wanting to work towards that extinction, not the animal kingdom extinction, but the artificial animals that we've effectively put in our reality, in our world,
yeah,
purely for enjoyment or for consumption of their. It's so, if you articulate it, it sounds so horrific.
yeah. Well, here's one statistic. I don't know if you're familiar with the biomass assessment. Took a look at all of the different forms of life on the planet Earth and calculated the percentage of, life in terms of carbon that they contain.
Yeah.
And mammalian animal species are a relatively small part of the entire total. But what was interesting about animals is when they got done with their assessment, they found out that 96% of the animal biomass on the planet is humans and livestock.
Oh yeah.
So 4% is wild.
Oh,
And
I know, it's diminishing at an extinctive rate.
But that brings home the idea, the realization that we think romantically about the idea of a romantic, wilderness, the wilderness preservation, and aren't we doing what we can to preserve all of that? Well, that's really an illusion when you look at these kinds of statistics, the way the human population civilization has really completely dominated the biosphere. Anyway, that's a topic for another day.
Well, no, but I think
I'm
we
going to
can't
talk about
give up.
spiders.
We can't give up on that though, George, because what
No,
I
we're
wanted
not
to.
going to give up on it. We're going to talk about it another day.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So the Ariadne. So you bring in the concept of a spider. Really interesting. I never made that connection between the thread of Ariadne's string and a spider.
Well, spiders are absolutely phenomenally amazing at what they can do, and yet almost all of their life and almost all of they're virtually invisible to humans. I mean, when we see a spider web, we go ick, or when we see a spider, it's creepy because it's got 8 legs, and we're not used to that. But they live in an amazing part of the ecosystem, and there are quite a lot more of them than we would think. The little niches they have, and their particular capacity for webs, creating webs, is really remarkable, and very sophisticated. And when we think of networks and drawing networks and how that all works, well, that's really the metaphor there is a spider web, creating a web that is all different things, and you tug on one part of the web and it communicates with all the other parts of the web. It is a network, and it's a rather remarkable feature of the world. So spiders are really pretty cool.
Yeah, that's interesting. Not a spiral, but it's all just a geometrical shape, right? A different kind of geometrical shape. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a network has sort of nodes and connecting points, and some of the connecting points are robust, having lots of connections, and others are kind of off on their own and having not so much network connection. And those are all the same kinds of patterns we see in human networks, and and social media, and the biological, the immune system networks. Really, I could have, instead of spiral inquiry, maybe it should be network inquiry. I don't know.
All right, let me see if I can pull this together, and I'm going to start with a critique of science. To me, the most coherent, like if I was going to advocate for somebody, if I was going to say, hey, you know what, you should build your critique around science this way, this is what I would suggest. Okay, so it would be something like put the brakes on it kind of scenario. And the reason why is that our scientific thirst and quest has been very much running counterpoint to, however perversely, we view progress. And so there's a lot of technological progress that's taking place, albeit with um, upside, but also with downside. And it's bound to the economic models that we are held slave to, essentially. And so you know that about me, that I'm a big climate guy, right? So when I look at this, I think if we're on an untethered path in every which vector that we can imagine in terms of scientific discovery, we have a lack of a like the psychology of a unilateral direction to a moonshot or a goal. And so what would happen is that you could label this something like a teleology, right? You say, well, what is the single thing that we need to focus towards, right? Or let's isolate it just a little bit, as opposed to saying we can go in whatever direction we want to go. I look at climate change as something that requires a dramatic amount of focus and almost like warlike focus on achieving that goal of biodiversity becoming sustainable with biodiversity. It's sustainable. I don't really like that word, but do you get my point on that? So a slowdown of the scientific march, the explosion.
Give me the arguments and tie it back to the text here. I'm listening.
Well, so what happens is that in this particular chapter with Consilience, E.O. Wilson is putting forward the claim poetically, like you had said, that Consilience is that thread, Ariadne's thread, that is our way back to a unification of sorts, right? Now, what seems to be left out, that I would like to advocate if I was, on Team Faith, for example, is I would say we just need to really, really temper ourselves in terms of the scientific explosion, right? We need to just slow down on the space exploration, right? Like if we're headed towards that cliff of extinction, we need to slow down dramatically and focus on increasing human relations. The space exploration program is a great one. How do we have this like ability to move forward, but yet, there's millions of people on the planet that are starving. It's like, part of me just doesn't get it.
Yeah. So I'm gonna argue with you.
Okay.
And I'm going to argue in the form of a distinction. And that distinction is between science and technology. So I think the exploration of science and the effort to understand systems and how they work is critical to solving climate change and every other problem we face. So I'm a firm believer in going full bore forward on scientific exploration and understanding. I think the critique that you're offering is one about what we do with that understanding when we find out the really great process, the value of the process of combusting carbon, that's sitting in the ground to make machinery that does fantastic things and brings new products to the world and powers our automobiles, gives us all these conveniences of life. That's a technology. It's a technological application of science, and I distinguish it from the science itself. And I think the problems that we are running into with climate change, for example, are really technological problems. We don't have to have so many cars. We don't have to have, cars so big. We don't even have to have cars, if we have cars, that use fossil fuels. but there are scientific principles that we need to learn about that get us to the point where we can use alternatives to try and achieve the same benefits for humanity that fossil fuels have given us, but to do it with, in a different way. And it doesn't mean that there aren't drawbacks to any of those technologies. I was reading one the other day. The technology associated with LED lighting is just a fantastic, brilliant series of complex inventions about chemistry, material science, the way these things work in terms of dealing with the production of light. And LEDs have been able to radically reduce the amount of energy that's required for the lighting that we like to have. So here's a way of drastically reducing the energy requirement and still getting the benefit for all that light. And light is, means education, it means reading, it means, entertainment, it means all of the stuff that you can do. I mean, back in the Paleolithic era, middle of winter, if you had 8 hours of daylight, that was it. You didn't have much you could do the rest of the time because the cost of trying to provide some kind of lighting sources just was prohibitive because the technology didn't admit it. So here's an example. And actually, this may be I might have gotten this from Daniel Pinker, I'm not sure. But the huge benefits that have resulted, let's not lose the benefits of having light in every home just because we have a climate problem. We're going to need science to solve that in a way that eliminates the need for fossil fuels to contribute to that end result. So I think the problem is not science, but technology, the one that you're after. I have a different problem with Wilson's Ariadne's thread model.
Okay.
And this is a different critique of science, and that is that science is really good at breaking things apart so to understand the components and how the unit components work. And I'm reminded when my son was 5 years old, he loved to break things apart because he wanted to understand. So he broke them apart. And science has done that with everything. It just breaks, reduction is, it breaks them apart, figures out how the units work. Wilson's claim in chapter 5 is, in that process, you just take this Ariadne's thread with you, leaving it attached at the front entrance to the cave, the Minotaur's cave, and when you get all the way down there in the deepest, darkest places of the cave where you've broken everything apart so you can understand how the components work, then you get back up again by following Ariadne's thread the other way. I don't think that metaphor works. As my son at the age of 5 quickly found out, if he breaks things apart to see how they work, it doesn't help him put it back together again. And in a lot of ways, the reductionism in the thread of scientific discovery has allowed great discoveries, but it's left science in a position of not being able to see how the whole fits back together. So a lot of again, this is kind of a faith in science that if you break things apart and you understand the components, you'll understand how it all works. But the other side of it is the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's one of the key findings of complexity theory in the 20th century is breaking apart. Understanding the component units doesn't necessarily answer the question of how the whole gets put back together again. And and Wilson really tries. I mean, he talks a lot about the ants and how they communicate with each other through pheromones and organize and all the rest of the stuff. And it kind of sounds reasonable, but ultimately the ants are not intelligent, and yet what they create in the society is highly intelligent and purposeful in its behavior. So the hive or the colony can act as an intelligent being and communicate with the outside world in a way that's really quite amazing, but you cannot understand that from the perspective of the individual unit component ant. So that's
right. Yeah. So this is for me the concept of God. That would be the idea of the god of the ants kind of thing. Right, that's their
Well,
world,
no,
right?
you don't have to jump to God, but you have to ask the question, how does this all come together? And that's what the field of complexity science is all about. And
Mm.
and Wilson takes a pass at kind of trying to describe his understanding of complexity science and network effects and other things. He's got some helpful introduction to complexity science here, but then he poo-poos it and says that it's not really going anywhere, and they haven't. Stuart Kauffman, the guy that founded the Santa Fe Institute, didn't really
Right.
get anywhere with it, and so he's still skeptical and he doesn't think it's going to work, without seeing that his form of reductionism doesn't work either. It leaves you with these mysteries about how groups of things can work together in such a way as to create a behaviors,
Mm.
intelligent behaviors that can't be explained on the basis of the individual units. It's something else emerges, and that's the mystical part of complexity theory, is trying to figure out, well, how this stuff emerges. And there are newer ways of thinking about this. Some people are arguing that you actually have the end result, or the purpose, is kind of pulling the system in a particular direction. Well, this is a little bit like reverse causality. Instead of
Mm.
individual components causing something, it's the end goal of the system is causing the system to emerge, to go in a particular direction. So there's lots of
Mm.
controversy about what that exactly means. Wilson touched upon it, brushes it off, but really isn't able to address the inadequacies of the reductionist model that he's holding on to. So that
Right,
was.
right. Well, I think there, for me, it's funny. I don't go. I first of all, I'll just make the statement that I don't really go there because I think there's so much work still to be made with science. However, I have come up with the idea that if science picks the low hanging fruit, the things that are reducible and testable, they may not be, and this is a little bit cliche, but going after the bigger questions, and that could be, from a mystical standpoint, but also it also manifests in I think what you're referring to is a complexity of systems, and so it's like, well, shit, what do you do with your PhD? Where do you put your study? Where you want, your advisor's going to say, go do something that will inch the edifice forward slightly.
Mhm.
And um, I I'm curious. So, for example, if this might be a hard question to answer, but can you help maybe just with the framing of it? Because I'm familiar with the Santa Fe Institute. I'm familiar with complexity theory slightly. I took a course at the Santa Fe Institute at one point on fractals.
Mhm.
Because I was really interested and I think Ken Ono's discovery of I was trying to think what Ken Ono did. It was this mathematical discovery he made several years ago, which kind of propelled him into like mathematical stardom, so to speak, right? So, anyways, I'm interested in this kind of pattern recognition that mathematics is so good at. And so, anyways, what I'm curious about is that you look at a complex system and you say the first thing that we're going to not do is break it down into its core constituent parts. So how do we analyze this in a way that, like, what do we do with that, right? Are we talking about something that's different than scientific method? Are we, like, give me an overview of how we approach that kind of a problem.
Well, it's a scientific enterprise, science and mathematical enterprise, but it is trying to look at the whole And I guess maybe the way to put it is it's recognizing that this system is fundamentally relational.
Yeah.
So the the old Newtonian paradigm of the very, very small mechanical pieces all working together, and deterministic laws of motion and gravity and all of this stuff that kind of hangs together, you know from the individual unit components interacting, and building up to the framework that we understand as as the entirety of the world. That that looks at the fundamental aspect of the world as being matter and energy. These discrete, and in quantum theory, they become discrete, they become quantized. So that is what it's all about in that mode of thinking, in the mechanistic way of thinking. What you have to do to get into complex systems is starting to look at the relationships between the units. I'll use a simple analogy, and I really like this one because think about water molecules, right? Individual units of water molecules sitting in a tub, and then pull the bottom out of the drain, the stopper out of the drain. And what happens? Well, the force of gravity is pulling all of those water molecules towards the drain. So they're all trying to rush into the drain. And as individual units, they're just bouncing around. But something happens that the pressure, the force pulling those water molecules toward the drain happens in an environment where some of the nudges produce a circular motion. Some bounce off the walls. But as this complex system begins to evolve, it explores the possibilities for how these particles might relate to each other. And those particles that relate in a circular format are the ones that for which they seem to be more successful. So the system evolves, and eventually, as the particles start revolving around each other, cooperating more rather than bumping into each other more, the efficient vorticular flow is established in that system. So you can't really imagine describing that by the individual particles bouncing into each other. But if you understand that the system encourages and evolves towards a more efficient form of exiting the tub, and that is a circular or spiral vorticular flow that has the right sets of qualities to achieve that goal of getting the particles through the hole with the minimization of turbulence. So that's a complex system, and it's mathematical, it's scientific, but it's also one that's where the issue is the relationship between and among and the evolving patterns that take place as this water rushes towards the drain. So I don't know if that helps put a perspective on it.
It does. It brings in a something that I'm very passionate about exploring. And funny enough, I'm actually doing it through a Greek portal discussing Isocrates, who was a famous rhetorician. Now, trust me, I'll pull this together. Is I really think that this is where the concept of probabilities actually came from. And so I don't know if I have it here, but there's have I shown you my little bone die before?
No.
The bone die, where is it? I don't know where I put it. Oh, it's right here. So this is a bone die called an astraguli. It comes from it's a knuckle bone from like a sheep or something, right? And so there's the Greeks would throw this down on a table, right?
Okay.
And
yep.
They would get, it basically represents an 80-20 rule or Pareto ratio.
Yep.
And so in our understanding and regurgitation of the ancient Greek, we really, really have an aversion against, as Plato did, against the rhetoricians. The rhetoricians are basically saying, look, a convincing speech, if I say something in a particular way, I'm actually thinking about the probability of it actually transmitting to you and to a group and to, its function as a whole. And so I'm saying that this is how we understand knowledge, is based off of like the probability of it actually transferring. So I'm going into a little bit more of an informational theory kind of concept. But when I do bring this idea, or you brought the idea of the bathtub and the water draining, I'm going to say that there's certain characteristics that we can describe where the molecules don't follow a similar kind of, or the path of the majority, right? So the majority defines the characteristics. So that means that not every molecule can be predicted on a deterministic path, but overall, how we describe the whole system, and I'm thinking, does it like take the form of a normal distribution? That'd be really interesting. It probably does. It probably does form some sort of like symmetrical distribution of like a bell curve or something. And that's what I imagined as I heard you talk about that, right? So there will be these things on the outside, that don't conform, but because the majority of it falls under, that's your characteristic, that's the defining shape of what happens, with that complex system. Mm-hmm. And I think that's fascinating. I think it's really, really fascinating. Did that make sense?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of parallels to questions of probability and questions of emergent phenomena, because it's not a certainty, and so it's not something that you can predict deterministically.
Yeah,
it's likely an evolutionary process, and it's likely in some sense a chaotic process, because very small changes in initial conditions can result in significantly different outcomes. And so there might be if I'm thinking the water moving towards the drain, there might be some obstruction in this flow that creates a barrier that significantly alters the flow for a significant number of the molecules, and it may end up, being quite different. So there was a theory floating around for a while that the flow of tub in a toilet would be different in the north of the equator and south of the equator because of the effect of the Coriolis force. That was debunked because the amount of force from being north or south in terms of the Earth's spin is not enough to affect the water in a toilet. But I thought it was interesting that minor changes can change things. So so I think probability comes into play in a lot of different ways, and that's one of those things that E.O. Wilson, in terms of trying to believing in the perfectibility of empirical science, has a hard time grappling with, as do a lot of people who would like things to be deterministic. It would make a whole lot more sense if things were deterministic. You could just sort of figure it out, but that's not the world we live in.
Well, so let me push back a little bit. I'm curious, because not too far into chapter 5, when he's talking about Ariadne string, he's saying that he again refers to the Greeks, and he says that the Greeks just had a more holistic approach to the way they viewed the world, right? And so when I read that, I was thinking that it's how we respond in science, in isolation, where our experiments are in a vacuum, where we isolate and break down, and the argumentation comes at its core constituents, right? But it seemed to me, when I read that part with E.O. Wilson, he was advocating for something that was more holistic, a unifying piece, right? And so it's interesting, because you and I can read the book and pull out slightly different interpretations. I don't know if that's the right word, but value out of it, right? And whether one of the pieces of the value is kind of critical, or one of the values is more, pastiche or critical. What's the, what is the ultimate, or what is the methodology for learning? And there, I can bring it back from a philosophy standpoint and say, well, is it more of a pessimistic or approach to reading a text, or is it more of a congratulatory sort of approach, celebratory sort of approach to reading a text? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
right.
And let me respond by saying that E.O. Wilson is definitely, wants a unified understanding, and he's really committed to that. It's and he wants a unified understanding. But the way he views it is, okay, you have to follow the reductionist path down into the deepest, darkest caves of the Minotaur, with the beauty of Ariadne's thread. You're not going to get lost down there. And then when you've reduced the universe down into its fundamentals, down to the very lowest level, and you've understood them at the level of physics, and then you turn around and you climb back out of the cave, the physics pulling together in certain ways creates the chemistry creates the biology creates the organism, the cells create the organism, and so he's viewing the pathway to a unified understanding as breaking it all apart and then seeing where all the pieces fit and then climbing out of it from there. And I just don't think that method is essentially trying to take the reductionist model as a way of approaching the understanding, breaking things apart, understanding in their discrete level, and thinking that is going to give you the understanding of the whole.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I want to say that I want to call this, and George, you feel okay to copyright this? It'll take a little bit of imagining here, right? Okay, but this is the George's version of the Ariadne string. Okay, so you got the Minotaur cave. Okay, and you're in that. You've got the string attached to your belt loop. Okay, and so you're looking at this maze and you're like, shit, okay, what does George do in this situation? I want to take a more holistic approach, George says to himself. So what he does is that he looks at the wall of the maze, and he's like, oh, there's a foothold there. So I'm going to put my foot in there. Oh, there's a spot up here. I can grab onto that. And so what George does is he says, screw it, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm going to climb up to the top. So now I can get up. And now George is looking around. He can see all he's got this, like, he's in this different plane. He's standing up there and he's like, well, screw this. Now I'm going to start running, and then I'm going to jump and I'm going to get this string to hold me, and I'm going to spin around like this. There's George swinging around on this string, right? He's just going, he's looking, he's like, hey, this is great. I can see everything that's going on. There was an exit here. There was an exit here. There was one here. Oh, wow. That's interesting. That's the George version of the Ariadne string. You feel free to copyright that.
I don't know. I came up with another model, and that is that maybe a little bit more consistent with complexity theory is, Ariadne's thread is maybe a good analogy, except if it's more like a real spider web, it's not going to be a single straight line. It's going to have interconnecting points. You're going to go down one pathway, come around, cross yourself, go over another pathway, go down, cross yourself, cross yourself, cross yourself, cross yourself, cross yourself, until you have this immense webbed, networked, complex thing. And now you're going to try to find the one strand that's going to lead you back out to the beginning. Oh, it's impossible, because what's been created here is a network of complex relationships. And the only way to understand the complex relationships is to understand the web in its entirety. You can't piece it apart and then try and tie it together again. It's like another branch of mathematics, which is truly bizarre, is the whole issue of knot theory. I've looked at it, I can't understand it at all. But the fact is that once you tie certain loops and you create knots, unraveling that becomes a nightmarishly difficult thing to do. I think some of those problems fall into the NP category of mathematical difficulty, which is like so difficult that the Clay Foundation has offered $1 million prize for anybody that can solve an NP complete problem. But so I think the web analogy here is a better one than swinging around through the rafters. Although I kind of like that.
Yeah, well, that one I offered is a bit of a spiral because it's going to put you. It's not like you're in a sustained orbit. You'd actually have to kind of fall down to the base again. So, but the idea, I actually, that's really good too about the web because it's. And then we brought up earlier before we went live is the spider's ability to sense all of these different locations, right?
Yeah.
And certainly we have the computability mechanisms to monitor various different things instantaneously, right? Like much faster than human cognition. So it doesn't mean that we're negating a technological or mathematical or computer science into these models. It just means that.
Yeah, but that gets you to another mess.
Oh.
Non-computability. And this again is one of the difficulties of a looking at the process of discovery as one that is sort of linear. We keep going, we'll eventually perfect science and mathematics, and we'll know all and be all, and won't that be great? I think it's a great aspiration and a great goal, but undecidability is one of the features of information science, computer science, and the simplest way of putting it, if you want to get technical, there's Turing's universal computing machine created this concept of the universal algorithm that can address any mathematical problem, can be created. So that's big data and all that stuff comes out of that universal computing machine. And so it's around the concept of an algorithm, which is a way of doing a set of calculations and and getting an end result. And one of the things he proved early in his efforts to explore this universe of beautiful possibilities is the fact that he wanted to know, all right, how do you know if a particular algorithm or calculation is going to finish? You want to know that it's going to be able to compute and come to an end result. Well, it's called the halting problem because he designed an algorithm conceptually that was going to tell you whether a given algorithm was going to halt or not. Was it going to find an answer or not? That's what the halting algorithm was supposed to do.
Oh, shit.
And the halting algorithm cannot prove that it can't determine. In other words, he could invent an algorithm that would fool the halting algorithm. So it's impossible to know whether a given calculation, a problem that you've posed for this universal computing machine, is ever going to be finished. It may take an infinite amount of time to get the answer. So that's non-computability. And another way of thinking about this is, again, complexity theory. When you have a system that is so complex, so many interacting parts that it can't, you really don't know. Well, okay, so come up with a computer to compute it. Well, if it's a non-reducible computation, according to Rudy Rucker, non-reducible means the only way to find out what's going to happen is actually let the system run. So you can't predict an outcome. You just have to see how the outcome arises. And that's a I love the way Rudy Rucker calls it a gnarly computation. It's just gnarly. It's going to have to run forever to see what happens. It's not something that can be used in a predictive, fashion. It can't be reduced. So there's another problem with this idea that we can bring computers to bear on these complicated problems, because it turns out some of these problems are so complicated that computers really aren't going to be able to solve it and aren't going to be helpful.
Well, I wonder if we could draw a likeness to the chances of um, like a human-like sapien emerging in a gang, or what was the chances of it, coming into existence at all? And to me, that sounds very close to what you described. There's no way for us to, based it on a sample size of one, right, on the phylogenetic chain, to say what are the chances in another environmental condition that we would arrive at this particular kind of consciousness again. Like, it seems incomputable. Would that be fair?
Right. That's fair to say that it seems like the pathway of evolution that has gotten us from the Big Bang through
Yeah.
cosmology, physics, chemistry, life emerging biology, to end up with the human being is like infinitesimally small. It has to be really small, the probability that we've actually followed that trajectory, and here we are.
Yeah. Or, well, to say, how do you repeat it? You know what I'm saying, right? Like, it just unfolded the way it unfolded, but
Yeah, well, that's a whole other question, because it was Stephen Gould, who came up with this idea of, it is so improbable that, if you ran the tape of life over again, what are the chances you come up with anything remotely similar?
yeah.
And the problem is there's another aspect of evolutionary theory, is that you have good examples of convergent evolution, which is the same evolutionary solution showing up multiple times
Right.
in different areas. And so, and I don't remember the best good examples, but, birds and bats evolved wings, but they didn't follow the same evolutionary path. Those wings
Right.
evolved
Yeah.
independently.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's something going on here about the way biology in two different, spheres is dealing with the physical characteristics of the planet on which they are. So it's likely, if you think in those, oh, you know what, on this planet, yeah, we'd get wings, air mass, we'd get wings, under any reasonable evolutionary path, we'll eventually get wings. And it may be the case that, under evolutionary pathways and this environment, yeah, we're eventually going to get a sentient species, because there's enough, the way life explores all the possibilities and all the niches and and just examines and explores and tries things out, yeah, eventually we'd get there. Which raises the whole question of teleology, because here now you're looking at a biological process, of evolving into something, and all of a sudden it doesn't look so different from a religious belief, right? The purpose of creation was, was to end up with sentient consciousness, that could love creation. That's a pretty religious concept. Anyway, that's complexity. So complexity comes in, the problems of mathematics come in. There are a lot of reasons, why, E.O. Wilson and many other scientists just, boy, the predictability of the scientific effort and the enterprise, and, we can break it down, we can understand it. When we gain an understanding, it's a beautiful, wonderful thing that happens, that feeling we understand. But to put it all together as a whole is something that, in my opinion, just extends quite beyond what the empirical science can can eventually reach because of things like, non-computability and, calculating probabilities of trajectories. And so there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on there.
Okay, I want to ask you a question about something that I was pondering this morning when I was thinking about the universe. Okay, so it's similar, it's somewhat related, but take you back to the Big Bang, where the entire universe was condensed into, I think, a pinpoint inside all of observable universe. Like it was so small, right? This is the idea where the Planck length and everything. So what was the smallest individual unit of condensed matter, where even atoms didn't exist? It was like a soupy kind of whatever it was, right? Mm-hmm. So so then there's that explosion, and I want you to think about the explosion for a minute, okay? And I want you to think about the directionality of the expansion of space. So the way you conceptualize this is space is expanding in every direction? Or is our very concept of direction not useful in this situation?
And I guess we have to puzzle a little bit about the fact that you've already established certain categories in asking the question about space.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a way of crafting some reasonable answer, intuitive answer to the question from the standpoint of space, because that's the way we're used to thinking. We're very spatially oriented kind of physical beings. It may not be the right question in terms of understanding what's actual, sort of being able to understand what's happening at that, when we call it a point in time. I was about to say that point in time. So we've already categorized what it is that we're looking at and the question we're asking. And I know there are some brilliant minds out there, David Ballman, Rudy Rucker, and others that have, thought about these things. And I can't understand what they're saying. But the point is, the idea is that something appears to have been the case when the universe was beyond what we can conceive of in terms of space and time. Maybe smaller than, maybe, was there infinity involved? Hard to say, but so something happened that phenomena began to occur, and so we could say in some sense, time and space became present. Maybe they weren't present before, or whatever that means to say before, but time and space became present, and then certain qualities, characteristics, measurable features began to manifest. And now one of the interesting questions is, when we look at the manifesting of events at Planck scale, we visualize that in terms of particles, and and particles being created, being formed, forces existing, forces, so there's a lot of things that we visualize, and the cosmologists have worked really, really hard to try to get the mathematics down so that it can actually describe certain things. And one of the ways they describe it is that there may be sort of a unitary feature of the universe at the, prior to the Big Bang. It's undescribable because it, was sort of like this perfectly symmetrical something. And then there was a breaking of symmetry, and certain qualities began to appear. Higgs force more breaking of symmetry, and then particles began to appear, and the electromagnetic, force cascaded out of a process. So in some period, we would call it period of time, these things cascaded out in a series of broken symmetries, and the physical universe began to look like something that we would recognize, where we have space, we have time, we have an expanding, something pushing, expanding the universe, and then as the different points arise, as the breaking of symmetry and more complexity arises in that structure, and pretty soon, again, to use a time metaphor, you have a universe that looks a lot like the universe we know of in terms of space, time, particles, the standard particles of physics, in place, the forces of strong force, weak force, gravity, electromagnetism. It looks like what we understand as the universe to be. So that is a way of trying to characterize this process of ending up from the Big Bang to a universe like what we understand the universe to be. And it does already have, it has time and space and particles and matter and mass and energy. It has all those things that we measure and try to understand and try and put together. So that's a short synopsis of my way of trying to describe something that's pretty indescribable.
There we have it. It's actually just on the hour. I think it's a great summary, and you heard it here first from George Gantz. This is the idea of breaking symmetries and the phenomenon that emerges. Right? I think that's great.
Yeah. So maybe on one of our next talks we can talk about how this implicates the multiverse or the not multiverse. I think that would be an interesting topic.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that one, but I will talk about it. I just find it to be weird and just goofiness, but well, I agree. Let's do it. Let's get it.
Wasn't weird goofiness. I know what is. Yeah. Daniel, it's just so much fun to be talking to you. It's just great to be able to explore these challenges, and we're following Ariadne's thread in a different way, and around, and it's all the same world, but there's a lot of different ways of thinking about it.
Oh, what a delicate web we weave, right? Okay, well, stay with me. We'll end and say goodbye to everybody. And so hold on. Okay, thanks, George.
All right. Thanks.